recorded, filed, and remembered. He died at his desk with ink still wet on a requisition form that would never be processed, and I understood then that his life had meant something precisely because it had been so small, so deliberate, so utterly committed to the preservation of continuity against the void. I became a jurist because I believed in that continuity. I studied the Lex Imperialis for 40 years, memorizing statutes that had not been invoked in millennia, learning the grammar of authority that predated the Horus heresy itself. I rose through the divisio juris with methodical patience, adjudicating disputes over tithe assessments and inheritance claims and jurisdictional boundaries, and I never once imagined that my career would place me in opposition to the Adeptus Astartes. Space Marines existed in a different category of imperial governance, a realm where law bent around necessity and doctrine replaced legal precedent. They were demigods, gene-crafted sons of the Emperor, and the Imperium had learned long ago that certain instruments of war could not be subjected to the same frameworks that governed ordinary men. But I was wrong about that. The Lex Ultima exists because even demigods can become liabilities. It was enacted in the final days of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor still walked among men and the cracks in his vision had not yet become chasms. The statute is brief, only 317 words in High Gothic, and it grants the Senatorum Imperialis the authority to nullify the legal existence of any imperial servant whose continued function represents a destabilizing threat to the unity of the realm. It does not mandate execution or exile or even censure. It simply erases recognition. It transforms heroes into non-entities, turning their deeds into unrecorded footnotes and their honors into administrative errors to be corrected. The law was designed for primarchs who might grow too powerful, for generals who might claim dominion over the sectors they had conquered, for saints whose cults might rival the imperial creed itself. It was never meant to be used, until it was. I received the summons on a morning that began like any other, with the pale grey light of Terra's artificial dawn filtering through the armored windows of my chambers. My servitor brought me recaf and a data slate containing the day's docket, and I reviewed the cases with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed the same ritual for decades. There were 14 disputes awaiting adjudication, most of them involving resource allocation disagreements between neighboring Forge worlds, and I had already drafted preliminary rulings for 11 of them. I expected to finish the remaining 3 before midday and spend the afternoon reviewing appeals from the Segmentum Pacificus. Then the second slate arrived. It was delivered by a Lucifer Black, one of the elite guards who serve the High Lords directly, and the sight of him standing in my doorway sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my chest. He said nothing, merely handed me the slate with both hands as though it were a relic, then departed without waiting for acknowledgement. The device was heavier than standard issue, its casing inscribed with the seal of the Senatorum and locked with encryption that required my biometric signature to open. I placed my thumb against the reader and felt the mechanism click, and the screen illuminated with text written in a script so formal it took me several seconds to parse. Lord Adjudicator Severin Colt, by order of the High Lords of Terra, you are hereby appointed primary jurist in the matter of the Brazen Vigil chapter, Adeptus Astartes, and charged with the investigation, documentation, and execution of judgment under the authority of the Lex Ultima. All necessary resources will be made available to you. All questions of jurisdiction are resolved in your favor. You will proceed with absolute discretion. Confirmation of receipt is required within 1 hour. I read it 3 times before the words truly settled. The Brazen Vigil. I knew the name, though not well. They were a fleet-based chapter founded during the 7th founding, descended from the lineage of Rogel Dawn, and they had spent the last 2 centuries prosecuting a crusade along the southern fringe of the galaxy. Their reputation was solid, if unremarkable, their record clean, their doctrine orthodox. They had reclaimed 17 worlds from Xenos occupation, destroyed 4 minor chaos cults, and lost fewer than 200 battle brothers over the course of their campaign. By any reasonable measure, they were exemplary servants of the Emperor. And now they were being subjected to the Lex Ultima, I sent my confirmation and waited. Within 3 hours, I was summoned to the Senatorum itself, a journey that required passage through security checkpoints so stringent that I was scanned, purified, and re-verified 6 times before I reached the inner sanctum. The chamber where I met the High Lord Adjudicant was not grand. It was small, windowless, and lined with shelves containing legal codices so ancient their spines had cracked into illegibility. The High Lord himself was a man I had never met, gaunt and colorless, his augmetic eyes clicking softly as they tracked my movements. He gestured for me to sit, and I obeyed. He did not waste time on pleasantries. "The Brazen Vigil has exceeded operational parameters," he said, his voice dry and without inflection. "They have begun refusing direct orders from the Segmentum command structure. They have requisitioned supplies without authorization. They have established governance over liberated worlds without seeking ratification from the Administratum. Their chapter master has publicly declared that his warriors answer only to the Emperor, not to mortal functionaries. This is not heresy. It is not rebellion. It is autonomy, and autonomy is intolerable." I asked why they had not been censured through conventional channels, why a fleet had not been dispatched to bring them to compliance. The High Lord's expression did not change. "Because a fleet would turn this into a war," he said, "and wars with Space Marines end in one of 2 ways. Either they are destroyed, which wastes a valuable asset and creates martyrs, or they win, which sets a precedent we cannot allow. The Lex Ultima offers a third option. We do not fight them. We unmake them." He explained the process with the detachment of a man describing crop rotation. "First, I would travel to the fleet's last known position and deliver formal notice of the investigation. The Brazen Vigil would be given the opportunity to respond, to justify their actions, to demonstrate compliance with Imperial law. If they refused or if their justifications were deemed insufficient, I would proceed to the second phase, which involved the freezing of all chapter assets, the suspension of their gene seed tithes, and the revocation of their founding charter. The third phase, if necessary, would nullify their historical record entirely, erasing their victories from official archives and reassigning their honors to successor chapters or guard regiments. They would still exist," the High Lord said, "but they would exist as ghosts. No recognition, no resupply, no future. Eventually, attrition would reduce them to a remnant, and that remnant would be absorbed or forgotten. There would be no battle, no martyrdom, only silence." I asked what would happen if they resisted. "Then you activate the final clause," he said. "You declare them renegade, and the full weight of the Imperium falls upon them. But that is not the goal. The goal is capitulation. The goal is obedience without the need for violence. That is the power of law, Adjudicator. It does not require a blade." I left the Senatorum with a sealed briefcase containing the necessary writs, authorizations, and documentation, and I returned to my chambers to prepare for a journey I had never imagined taking. I was 54 years old, and I had never left Terra. I had never seen a battlefield, never spoken to a Space Marine, never held authority over anything more significant than procedural disputes. Now I was being sent to judge demigods. I did not sleep that night. I thought about my father, about the way he had described the Imperium as a vast and fragile engine held together by 10,000 years of accumulated effort, and I wondered whether I was being asked to preserve that engine or to damage it. I thought about the Brazen Vigil, about the warriors who had bled and died in the Emperor's name, and I wondered whether they understood that their heroism could be erased as easily as a clerical error. I thought about the Lex Ultima itself, about the minds that had drafted it and the terror that must have driven them to create a law so absolute, so final, so devoid of mercy. And I realized that I was not being sent to judge Space Marines. I was being sent to remind them that they were not beyond judgment. The journey to the southern fringe took 6 weeks aboard a fast courier vessel escorted by 3 frigates, and I spent every hour of that voyage reviewing the evidence against the Brazen Vigil. The data was overwhelming. Thousands of pages of communication logs, supply manifests, strategic reports, and testimony from Imperial commanders who had worked alongside the chapter. The pattern was unmistakable. The Brazen Vigil had begun their crusade as loyal servants of the Imperium, coordinating closely with the sector battle fleet and requesting approval for every major operation. But over time, that coordination had eroded. They had started ignoring Vox transmissions from Fleet Command. They had stopped submitting casualty reports. They had established provisional governments on reclaimed worlds without waiting for administratum approval, installing their own chosen governors and demanding tithes that went directly to the chapter rather than to Terra. None of it was heretical, none of it was treasonous, but all of it was illegal. The final straw had come 3 months earlier, when the chapter master, a warrior named Halvran Tain, had refused a direct order to redeploy to a neighboring sector where an orc incursion threatened an agri-world. He had claimed that his crusade was incomplete, that abandoning the southern fringe would undo years of progress, and that the administratum's prioritization was flawed. He had been polite, even deferential, but he had refused nonetheless. The order had come from a Lord General, a man with the authority to command entire battle groups, and Halvran Tain had treated it as a suggestion to be declined. That was the moment the Senatorum invoked the Lex Ultima. I read Halvran's response to the redeployment order 17 times, searching for arrogance or contempt, but I found neither. His words were calm, reasoned, almost mournful. He explained that the southern fringe had been neglected for centuries, that its worlds had suffered under Xeno's dominion while Imperial forces focused on wealthier sectors, and that the Brazen Vigil had been created to fight wars that others ignored. He argued that his chapter's mission was to bring the Emperor's light to the forgotten, and that redirecting them to defend established holdings would betray that mission. He closed by affirming his loyalty to the Imperium and requesting that his perspective be elevated to the High Lords for review. It was not a refusal born of pride. It was a refusal born of conviction. And conviction, in the eyes of the Senatorum, was just as dangerous. The courier exited the warp on the edge of the Verosian sector, a region of space so distant from Terra that the light of the Astronomicon flickered like a failing lumen. The local star was a sullen red giant, and the planets orbiting it were lifeless rocks, scarred by ancient bombardments. The Brazen Vigil's fleet was stationed near the fourth planet, a formation of 6 ships ranging from a battle barge to a handful of strike cruisers, and they detected our arrival within seconds. I watched from the observation deck as our escorts moved into defensive positions, and I felt the weight of what I was about to do settle over me like a shroud. A Vox transmission arrived within minutes. "This is Strike Captain Vorian Keth of the Brazen Vigil. Identify your vessel and state your purpose." The courier's captain responded with my credentials, and there was a long silence before the reply came. "Lord Adjudicator Colt, you are granted permission to board the Unbroken Oath. A Thunderhawk will retrieve you within the hour. Know that you come as a guest, and guests are treated with honor." I gathered my materials and prepared to meet the Brazen Vigil face to face. The Thunderhawk was a blunt, scarred machine that looked as though it had survived 1,000 battles, its hull pitted with impacts and scorched by weapons fire. The pilot said nothing as I boarded, and I sat alone in the passenger compartment, gripping the armrests, as the gunship detached from the courier and accelerated toward the battle barge. The journey took only minutes, but it felt longer, the silence broken only by the hum of the engines and the occasional vibration as the craft adjusted its trajectory. Through the viewport, I could see the Unbroken Oath growing larger, a cathedral of steel and fury that dwarfed our escort frigates. The hangar bay was vast and dimly lit, filled with rows of Thunderhawks and Storm Ravens and Land Raiders, all of them marked with the bronze and white heraldry of the chapter. Servitors moved between the vehicles with mechanical precision, performing maintenance rituals while tech priests chanted Binharic prayers. The air smelled of incense and promethium, and the temperature was uncomfortably warm. I descended the ramp and found myself standing before a space marine. He was enormous, easily twice my height, his armor a masterwork of ceramite and gold filigree. His helmet was maglocked to his belt, revealing a face that was both human and utterly alien, square-jawed and scarred, with eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. He inclined his head in a gesture that might have been respect or merely acknowledgement. "I am Strike Captain Vorian Keth," he said, his voice a deep rumble that resonated in my chest. "Welcome aboard the Unbroken Oath, Lord Adjudicator. Chapter Master Tain is waiting." He turned and began walking, and I followed, struggling to match his pace. The corridors of the battle barge were like the interior of a fortress, wide and high-ceilinged, lined with statues of Imperial saints and banners commemorating victories I did not recognize. We passed chapter serfs who pressed themselves against the walls as we approached, and I saw the way they looked at Vorian, the mixture of awe and fear that marked those who lived among demigods. I wondered if they understood that their masters were under investigation, that everything they had built might soon be taken from them. We arrived at a chamber that could only be described as a throne room, though it lacked the ostentation of true nobility. The walls were bare stone, the floor polished black marble, and the only furnishings were a long table and a dozen chairs sized for warriors in power armor. At the head of the table sat Halvran Tain, the chapter master of the Brazen Vigil, and the sight of him stole the air from my lungs. He was older than Vorian, his face lined with scars that spoke of centuries of war, and his armor was simpler, almost austere, marked only with the chapter's symbol and a single purity seal. His eyes were grey, the color of storm clouds, and they settled on me with an intensity that made me feel as though I were being weighed and measured. He did not stand, did not salute, did not offer any of the formalities I had expected. He simply looked at me and spoke. "You have come to judge us," he said, "so judge." I placed my briefcase on the table and opened it, removing the writ of investigation and the documentation authorizing my presence. I explained the charges as clearly as I could, outlining the incidents of non-compliance, the refusal to redeploy, the unauthorized governance of liberated worlds. I cited the relevant statutes, referenced the legal precedents, and made it clear that this was not a theological matter or a question of loyalty, but a straightforward application of Imperial law. Halvran listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, and when I finished, he folded his hands on the table and spoke with the calm certainty of a man who had already considered every argument I might make. "We have violated no law," he said. "We have pursued the mission for which we were created. The Imperium gave us worlds to reclaim, and we have reclaimed them. It gave us enemies to destroy, and we have destroyed them. If coordination with mortal commanders were a requirement of our existence, then the Codex Astartes would say so. It does not. We are autonomous because autonomy is necessary. We operate in regions where Imperial authority is theoretical at best, where the Administratum's writs are centuries out of date, and where waiting for approval means watching worlds burn. You accuse us of insubordination. I accuse the Imperium of forgetting what it means to wage war." I had anticipated this defense, and I responded with the patience of a teacher correcting a student. "The Codex Astartes does not grant unlimited autonomy," I said. "It establishes operational independence within the framework of Imperial authority. That authority includes the right to issue strategic directives, to allocate resources, and to determine priorities. When you refused the redeployment order, you placed your judgment above that of the Lord General. That is not autonomy. That is insurrection." Halvran's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, a brief flash of anger or frustration that vanished almost immediately. "And if the Lord General's judgment was flawed," he said, "should we obey regardless? Should we abandon a crusade that has saved millions in order to defend a single agri-world that could be held by the Guard? The Imperium is not omniscient, adjudicator. Its bureaucrats are not infallible. We were created to make decisions that mortal men cannot, and sometimes those decisions require us to act against our orders." I leaned forward, meeting his gaze. "Then you misunderstand your purpose," I said. "You were not created to make decisions. You were created to execute them. The Imperium does not need warriors who think for themselves. It needs warriors who obey." If every chapter master decided that his judgment superseded Imperial command, the Astartes would fracture into 1,000 independent warbands, each pursuing its own vision of righteousness. That is what happened during the Horus Heresy. That is what the Lex Ultima exists to prevent. Halvran stood, and the movement was sudden enough that I flinched despite myself. He towered over me, his shadow swallowing the light, and for a moment I thought he might strike me down, but he did not. He simply looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You speak of the heresy as though it were a failure of obedience," he said. But it was not. It was a failure of faith. Horus fell because he believed himself equal to the Emperor, because he thought his vision was superior. We do not suffer from that delusion. We know our place. But our place is not at the feet of bureaucrats who have never bled for the Imperium, who have never stood on a battlefield and watched brothers die for worlds they will never see. Our place is in the void, in the dark, in the forgotten corners where the Emperor's light barely reaches. If you believe that law can govern that darkness, then you are a fool. I felt the sting of his words, but I did not let it show. The law does not need to govern darkness, I said. It only needs to govern you. The silence that followed was absolute. Halvran returned to his seat, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet. "What do you want from us, adjudicator?" I told him the truth. Compliance. Acknowledgement that imperial authority supersedes chapter autonomy. A formal apology for the refusal to redeploy. A commitment to submit all future operations for approval by the appropriate commanders, and a demonstration of good faith, such as reassigning a portion of your fleet to the sector that requested your aid. Halvran considered this for a long moment. "And if we refuse?" "Then the investigation proceeds to the next phase," I said. "Your chapter assets will be frozen, your gene seed tithes will be suspended, your founding charter will be revoked. You will continue to exist, but you will exist without recognition, without resupply, without history. Eventually, attrition will reduce you to nothing, and the brazen vigil will be forgotten." Halvran's eyes narrowed. "You would erase us." "I would not," I said. "The law would." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "And you believe the law is just?" "I believe the law is necessary," I said. "Justice is a luxury the Imperium cannot afford." Halvran stood again, and this time he gestured for me to follow. "I want to show you something," he said. We walked through the corridors of the Unbroken Oath, past armories and chapels and training halls, until we reached a chamber that was smaller and quieter than the others. It was a memorial, the walls lined with plaques bearing the names of fallen battle brothers, each one inscribed with the date and location of their death. There were hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, and Halvran moved among them with the reverence of a man visiting graves. "These are the warriors who died for your Imperium," he said. "They did not die because they were ordered to. They died because they believed their deaths mattered. They believed that every world they reclaimed, every life they saved, would be remembered. And now you tell me that their sacrifices can be erased, that their names can be stricken from the record because a bureaucrat in a distant palace decided they were inconvenient." He turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that I had not expected. Grief. "Tell me, adjudicator," he said, "do you think the Emperor would approve of this law? Do you think he would look at these names and say that they deserved to be forgotten?" I did not have an answer. Halvran waited, and when I said nothing, he nodded as though I had confirmed something he already knew. "You are not here to serve the Emperor," he said. "You are here to serve the machinery that has replaced him. And that machinery does not care about faith or valor or sacrifice. It cares only about control." He walked past me, back toward the corridor, and paused at the threshold. "I will give you my answer in 3 days," he said. "Until then, you are a guest aboard this vessel. You will be treated with honor. But know this, adjudicator, if you proceed with this investigation, you will not unmake the brazen vigil. You will unmake yourself." He left, and I stood alone in the memorial, surrounded by the names of the dead. I spent the next 3 days aboard the Unbroken Oath, and they were the strangest days of my life. The brazen vigil treated me with a courtesy that bordered on reverence, assigning me quarters that were austere but clean, providing me with meals that were simple but prepared with care. I was free to move through the ship, to observe the daily rituals of the chapter, to speak with serfs and battle brothers, and even the chaplains who guided their spiritual lives. No one questioned my presence, no one expressed hostility, and yet I felt the weight of their judgment in every glance, every silence. I watched them train in the combat cages, their movements precise and brutal, and I understood that these were not men who feared death. I attended a service in the Reclusium, listening as a chaplain spoke of duty and sacrifice, and I saw the way the warriors bowed their heads, their faith absolute and unshakable. I walked through the gene seed repositories, where the legacy of their primarch was preserved in vials of genetic material, and I felt the sanctity of the place, the sense that I was standing in a shrine, and I began to doubt. Not the law, not my mission, but the assumption that had driven the Senatorum to invoke the Lex Ultima in the first place, the assumption that the Brazen Vigil were destabilizing, the assumption that their autonomy was a threat. I saw no arrogance among them, no desire for power or recognition. I saw only warriors who believed in their purpose, who had spent centuries bleeding for an Imperium that had given them nothing but orders and expected everything in return. On the second day, I spoke with a battle brother named Theron, a veteran of 300 years who had lost his left arm in a battle against Tyranids. He had replaced it with a bionic limb, crude but functional, and he told me that he had refused a more advanced augmetic because he wanted to remember the price of failure. We stood on the observation deck, looking out at the stars, and he asked me why I had come. I told him the truth. Because your chapter refuses to obey. He nodded, unsurprised. And you believe obedience is more important than victory? I believe obedience is what prevents victory from becoming tyranny, I said. Theron smiled, a sad, weary expression. Then you have never fought a war, adjudicator. War does not care about obedience, it cares about results. The Imperium tells us to fight, and we fight. It tells us to die, and we die. But it does not tell us how to win, because the men who give the orders are too far from the battlefield to understand what winning requires. If we waited for approval every time we made a decision, we would still be fighting the same wars our predecessors fought 10,000 years ago. I asked him if he believed the Brazen Vigil were above the law. He shook his head. No. But I believe the law should serve the Imperium, not the other way around. And if your law would erase us for doing what we were created to do, then it is not a just law. I had no response. On the third day, Halvran summoned me to the bridge, and I knew that he had made his decision. The Bridge of the Unbroken Oath was a cathedral of stone and steel, its vaulted ceiling inscribed with prayers to the Emperor, its walls lined with tactical displays and cogitator banks. Halvran stood at the center, surrounded by his officers, and when I entered, they all turned to look at me. Halvran spoke without preamble. "We will not comply," he said. "We will not apologize for pursuing our mission. We will not submit our operations for approval by commanders who do not understand the wars we fight. And we will not accept the authority of a law that values bureaucracy over faith." I felt the finality of his words, the weight of a bridge being burned. "Then you leave me no choice," I said. "I will proceed to the next phase. Your assets will be frozen. Your gene seed tithes will be suspended. Your charter will be revoked." Halvran nodded. "Do what you must, but know that we will continue our crusade regardless. We do not fight for recognition, we fight because it is right." I returned to the courier that same day, and as the Thunderhawk carried me back across the void, I looked at the Unbroken Oath one last time and wondered if I would ever see it again. I transmitted my findings to the Senatorum, recommending that the investigation proceed to Phase 2, and I waited for their response. It came within hours, a terse confirmation that my recommendations had been accepted and that the necessary orders were being issued. The Brazen Vigil were being unmade. The process was slower than I had anticipated, a bureaucratic dismantling that unfolded over weeks and months. The first step was the freezing of chapter assets, which meant that every Forge World, every supply depot, every administratum office that had provided the Brazen Vigil with equipment or resources was instructed to cease all support. Requests for ammunition were denied, requisitions for spare parts were rejected, contracts for ship repairs were cancelled. The chapter was not forbidden from operating, but they were forbidden from receiving aid. The second step was the suspension of gene seed tithes, which struck at the heart of what it meant to be a Space Marine chapter. Every chapter was required to submit a portion of their gene seed to the Adeptus Mechanicus, both as a safeguard against genetic degradation and as a means of creating future chapters. The Brazen Vigil's tithes were frozen, their genetic legacy locked away in vaults on Mars, and they were informed that no new initiates could be created until compliance was restored. This was a death sentence delivered in slow motion, because without the ability to replenish their numbers, the chapter would eventually dwindle to nothing. The third step was the revocation of their founding charter, a document that had been signed by the High Lords of Terror during the 7th founding, and that granted the Brazen Vigil legal recognition as a Space Marine chapter. The revocation did not declare them traitors or heretics. It simply stated that their founding had been an administrative error, that their existence was not sanctioned, and that they were no longer entitled to the rights and privileges of the Adeptus Astartes. Their heraldry was removed from the official registries. Their victories were reassigned to other units. Their history was rewritten as though they had never existed. And through it all, I received reports. Reports from Forge Worlds that had stopped supplying the Brazen Vigil. Reports from Battlefleet commanders who had been instructed to deny them safe harbor. Reports from administratum officials who had been ordered to treat the chapter as non-entities. The reports were dry, factual, devoid of emotion, but I could read between the lines. The Brazen Vigil were being strangled, not with violence but with neglect, and they were powerless to stop it. I waited for them to capitulate. They did not. Instead, they adapted. The first indication came in a report from a Forge World in the Verosian sector, which noted that a strike cruiser bearing the markings of the Brazen Vigil had arrived in orbit and requested permission to trade for supplies. When the Forge World denied the request, citing the Senatorum's directive, the cruiser had departed without incident. But 3 days later, a caravan of merchants arrived at the Forge World's primary starport, claiming to represent an independent mercantile guild, and they began purchasing ammunition, promethium, and spare parts in quantities that seemed excessive for civilian use. The Forge World's authorities grew suspicious and launched an investigation, only to discover that the merchants were chapter serfs, and the guild was a front. The Brazen Vigil had started buying what they could no longer requisition. Similar reports arrived from other sectors. The chapter was trading salvage from battlefields for supplies. They were negotiating directly with rogue traders, offering protection in exchange for equipment. They were even manufacturing their own ammunition and components using workshops aboard their ships, bypassing the Mechanicus entirely. It was illegal, inefficient, and desperate, but it was working. I escalated the matter to the Senatorum, recommending that enforcement actions be taken to prevent third parties from aiding the chapter, but the response was dismissive. The High Lord Adjudicant informed me that such enforcement would require resources the Imperium could not spare, and that the Brazen Vigil's makeshift supply chains would eventually collapse under the weight of attrition. He instructed me to be patient, to allow the law to take its course. But patience felt like complicity. I began to dream about the memorial chamber, about the names of the dead inscribed on those plaques, and I wondered how many more names would be added before the Brazen Vigil finally broke. I wondered if the warriors who fell in the years to come would understand that they were dying not for the Emperor but for a bureaucratic principle, that their gene seed would never be harvested, their deeds never recorded, their sacrifices never honored. I wondered if Halvrantain thought about those things, or if he had made peace with the knowledge that his chapter was doomed. I received my answer 6 months after the investigation began. A message arrived via encrypted Vox, routed through a dozen relay stations to obscure its origin, and when I decrypted it, I found a single line of text. You were right, Adjudicator. The law does not need to govern darkness. But neither do we. It was unsigned, but I knew it was from Halvran. I tried to trace the message, to determine where it had been sent from, but the encryption was too sophisticated, the relays too numerous. I filed the message in my records and waited for the next report, the next indication of what the Brazen Vigil were planning. I expected defiance, perhaps even violence, a desperate strike against the Administratum, or a refusal to surrender their gene seed. I expected them to burn brightly before they died, but they did not burn. They vanished. The reports stopped arriving. The Forge Worlds, the battle fleets, the Administratum offices, all of them confirmed that the Brazen Vigil had ceased all communication. Their fleet had disappeared from the southern fringe, their last known position abandoned, their strike cruisers gone without a trace. Search patrols found no wreckage, no debris, no sign of battle. It was as though the chapter had simply stepped into the void and pulled the darkness over themselves like a shroud. The Senatorum convened an emergency session, and I was summoned to provide testimony. The High Lords demanded answers. They wanted to know where the Brazen Vigil had gone, whether they had turned renegade, whether they posed a threat to Imperial holdings. I told them the truth. I did not know. The chapter had complied with the letter of the law by ceasing all interaction with Imperial authorities, but they had not surrendered, had not disbanded, had not accepted erasure. They had chosen a fourth option, one that the Lex Ultima had not anticipated. They had chosen exile. The High Lord Adjudicant was furious. "This is unacceptable," he said. "The law demands resolution. Either they capitulate or they are destroyed. They cannot simply disappear." But they could, and they had. The Senatorum issued a final directive declaring the Brazen Vigil renegade and authorizing any Imperial force to engage them on sight. Bounties were placed on their officers. Their gene seed was declared forfeit. Their name was added to the lists of chapters that had fallen from grace, not through heresy but through defiance, and I was ordered to consider the matter closed. But I could not. I returned to my chambers on Terra, to the grey light and the endless dockets, and I tried to resume my old life. I adjudicated disputes, reviewed appeals, drafted rulings. I performed the rituals that had once given my existence meaning, but they felt hollow now, mechanical. I kept thinking about Halvran's words, about the accusation that I was serving machinery rather than the Emperor, and I could not shake the feeling that he had been right. I began to search for information about the Brazen Vigil, not through official channels but through rumors, whispers, unverified reports that filtered in from the fringes of the galaxy. I heard stories about unmarked ships appearing in contested systems, engaging Xenos forces with brutal efficiency, then disappearing before Imperial reinforcements arrived. I heard about worlds on the edge of known space, places where the Administratum had no presence, receiving aid from anonymous benefactors who wore bronze and white. I heard about a chapter that no longer existed fighting wars that no one else would fight. And I understood what Halvran had done. He had not defied the law, he had transcended it. The Brazen Vigil no longer needed recognition, no longer needed resupply, no longer needed the Imperium's permission to exist. They had become what they had always claimed to be. Warriors who served the Emperor rather than the machinery that had replaced him. They had accepted erasure and turned it into freedom. I wrote a report documenting my findings, my suspicions, my growing certainty that the Lex Ultima had failed in its purpose. I argued that the law had not unmade the Brazen Vigil but had instead created something more dangerous, a chapter that operated entirely outside Imperial oversight, accountable to no one, bound by nothing except their own sense of duty. I recommended that the Senatorum reconsider the use of the Lex Ultima, that they recognize the limitations of legal annihilation, that they acknowledge the possibility that some instruments of war could not be governed by statute. The report was filed and ignored. I was reassigned to a new docket, a new set of disputes, and the Brazen Vigil were forgotten by everyone except me. I continued my work, continued my service, but I no longer believed in the continuity I was preserving. I no longer believed that law alone could hold the Imperium together. I had seen the limits of authority, the boundaries beyond which even the most absolute power could not reach, and I had learned that erasure was not the same as victory. Years passed. I grew older, my hair graying, my hands developing the tremor that comes with age and regret. I adjudicated 10,000 cases, drafted 100,000 rulings, and none of them mattered as much as the one case I had failed to resolve. I thought about Halvran often, wondered if he was still alive, still fighting, still leading his chapter through the darkness. I imagined him standing in the memorial chamber, adding new names to the walls, and I wondered if my name would ever appear there, not as a fallen warrior, but as a reminder of what the Brazen Vigil had overcome. On the 40th anniversary of my appointment as primary jurist, I received a package. It was delivered by a courier I did not recognize, a nondescript man who handed me a sealed container and departed without explanation. I opened it in the privacy of my chambers and found a single item inside, a purity seal. It was old, the parchment yellowed and brittle, the wax cracked. The text was written in High Gothic, a prayer to the Emperor, and it bore the mark of the Brazen Vigil. Beneath the prayer, in smaller script, was a message. For the adjudicator who taught us that law cannot govern faith. We remember. I held the seal in my hands and felt the weight of everything I had done, everything I had failed to do, and I understood that this was not a gift, it was an acknowledgement. The Brazen Vigil had not forgotten me, had not dismissed me as an enemy or a tool of the Senatorum. They had recognized me as something more complicated, a servant of the Imperium who had tried to preserve it in the only way he knew how, even if that way had been flawed. I placed the seal in a drawer, alongside the documentation of the case that had defined my life, and I returned to my work. But I never forgot Halvran's final words, the warning he had given me before I left the unbroken oath. If you proceed with this investigation, you will not unmake the Brazen Vigil, you will unmake yourself. He had been right. The Lex Ultima had not destroyed the Brazen Vigil. It had revealed the limits of law, the boundaries of control, the truth that some things could not be erased no matter how absolute the authority. And in revealing those limits, it had unmade my certainty, my faith in the machinery I served, my belief that continuity could be preserved through statute and decree. I had set out to judge demigods, and I had learned that demigods did not fear judgment. They feared nothing at all. I am an old man now, decades removed from the case that defined me, and I still serve the Adeptus Administratum. I still adjudicate disputes, still draft rulings, still perform the rituals that hold the Imperium together. But I do so with the knowledge that the structure I preserve is more fragile than I once believed, that the laws I enforce are less absolute than I once imagined, and that the warriors who defend humanity are not bound by the same constraints that govern mortal men. The Brazen Vigil are gone from the official record, their history erased, their victories reassigned, their existence nullified. But they are not gone from the galaxy. I know this because the reports still arrive, filtered through layers of bureaucracy, dismissed as rumors or misidentifications. Ships bearing bronze and white heraldry appear in war zones where no chapter should be. Worlds on the edge of extinction receive aid from anonymous benefactors. Xenos forces are destroyed by warriors who vanish before they can be identified. The Imperium does not acknowledge these events, does not investigate them, does not care. The machinery grinds forward, indifferent to the ghosts that haunt its edges. But I care. I care because I understand what the Brazen Vigil represent. They are proof that the Imperium's control is not absolute, that its laws can be defied, that its authority can be transcended. They are proof that faith and conviction can survive even when recognition is stripped away, even when history is rewritten, even when existence itself is denied. They are proof that the Emperor's servants do not need the Imperium's permission to serve. And that terrifies the Senatorum more than any rebellion ever could. Because rebellion can be crushed, heresy can be purged, treason can be punished. But faith, true faith, the kind that exists independent of reward or recognition or even survival, cannot be controlled. It can only be endured. The Lex Ultima was designed to prevent another Horus, to ensure that no servant of the Emperor could grow powerful enough to challenge the Imperium itself. But it was based on a flawed assumption, the belief that power comes from recognition, that authority derives from legal sanction, that existence requires official acknowledgement. The Brazen Vigil proved that assumption wrong. They demonstrated that a chapter could continue to function, to fight, to serve, even after being erased from the record. They showed that the Imperium's greatest weapon, its ability to control through bureaucracy, had limits. And those limits are what keep me awake at night. I think about the other chapters, the thousands of Space Marine formations that serve the Imperium with varying degrees of autonomy, and I wonder how many of them have considered the example set by the Brazen Vigil. I wonder how many of them have looked at the Lex Ultima and seen it not as a deterrent, but as a challenge, a proof that defiance is possible, that exile is survivable, that erasure is not the end. I wonder if the Senatorum understands the precedent they have set, the door they have opened. I suspect they do not. The Imperium is vast beyond comprehension, its bureaucracy so labyrinthine that no single mind can grasp its totality, and the High Lords are insulated from the consequences of their decisions by layers of hierarchy and distance. They invoked the Lex Ultima because they believed it would resolve a problem cleanly, efficiently, without the mess of open conflict. They believed that legal annihilation would be easier than war. But annihilation implies finality, and the Brazen Vigil are not finished. They are still out there, beyond the reach of law, beyond the reach of authority, and they are still fighting. Not for the Imperium, perhaps, but for the Emperor. Not for recognition, but for righteousness. And that distinction, subtle as it seems, is the foundation of everything the Senatorum fears. Because if the Brazen Vigil can serve the Emperor without serving the Imperium, then what is the Imperium for? That is the question the Lex Ultima was meant to prevent anyone from asking. That is the question Halvrantain forced me to confront. And that is the question I have carried with me every day since I left the Unbroken Oath. I do not have an answer. I do not know whether the Imperium is a necessary structure, a framework that holds humanity together in a galaxy determined to destroy it, or whether it is a parasite, a bloated hierarchy that consumes the very people it claims to protect. I do not know whether the Brazen Vigil are heroes or fools, saints or criminals. I do not know whether I was right to invoke the Lex Ultima, or whether I should have refused, should have resigned, should have walked away rather than become complicit in their erasure. But I know this. The law, for all its power, for all its authority, for all its claim to represent the will of the Emperor himself, is only as strong as the people who enforce it. And when those people doubt, when they question, when they see the limits of what law can achieve, the entire structure begins to fracture. I am that fracture. I am the crack in the foundation, the weakness in the system, the jurist who no longer believes in the judgments he renders. And I am not alone. I see it in the faces of my colleagues, in the hesitation that creeps into their voices when they discuss cases involving the Adeptus Astartes, in the way they avoid mentioning the Brazen Vigil as though speaking the name might summon something they cannot control. The Lex Ultima was meant to be a safeguard, a final recourse against the possibility of another betrayal on the scale of the Horus heresy. But it has become something else. It has become a reminder that the Imperium is not invincible, that its control is not absolute, that its laws can be defied by those with the courage to accept the consequences. And courage, in the end, is what the Brazen Vigil possessed in abundance. Halvrantain understood what I did not. He understood that recognition is not the same as validation, that existence does not require acknowledgement, that a chapter's worth is measured not by the honors it receives, but by the wars it fights. He understood that the Imperium could take away his fleet's supply lines, could freeze his gene seed, could erase his chapter's history from the records, but it could not take away the faith that sustained his warriors. And so he chose exile, not as a defeat but as a liberation. I envy him for that. I envy the clarity of his conviction, the certainty that allowed him to walk away from everything the Imperium offered in exchange for the freedom to serve the Emperor on his own terms. I envy the warriors who followed him, who accepted erasure without hesitation, who continued to fight even after the galaxy forgot they existed. I envy their faith, their purpose, their refusal to be defined by anything except their own sense of duty. And I hate them for it, because they proved that I was wrong. They proved that the law is not enough, that authority is not sufficient, that the Imperium's control is an illusion sustained by the compliance of those it governs. They proved that the moment someone refuses to comply, the moment someone chooses exile over obedience, the entire structure begins to collapse. And that collapse has already begun. I have seen it in the reports that cross my desk, in the cases that arrive with increasing frequency, in the whispers that circulate through the halls of the Divisio Juris. Other chapters are asking questions. Other officers are pushing boundaries. Other servants of the Imperium are beginning to wonder whether obedience is truly necessary, whether the Senatorum's authority is truly absolute, whether the law truly represents the Emperor's will. The Brazen Vigil did not start a rebellion. They started something worse. They started doubt. And doubt, once planted, cannot be uprooted. It spreads like a virus, infecting minds and eroding certainty. And no amount of legal enforcement can stop it. The Senatorum can invoke the Lex Ultima 1,000 times, can erase 1,000 chapters, can nullify 1,000 histories, but it will not stop the spread of doubt. Because every erasure is proof that the law is fragile, that authority is contingent, that the Imperium's control is not as absolute as it claims. I have become a witness to that fragility, and it has broken me. I sit in my chambers, reviewing cases that no longer seem to matter, and I think about the purity seal locked in my drawer. I think about the warriors who sent it to me, who remembered my name even after the galaxy forgot theirs, and I wonder if they understand the gift they have given me. They have given me hope. Not hope for the Imperium, not hope for the law, but hope for something deeper. Hope that faith can survive erasure, that conviction can endure annihilation, that the Emperor's servants can continue to serve even when the machinery that governs them collapses into ruin. Hope that humanity, for all its flaws, for all its capacity for cruelty and stupidity and bureaucratic indifference, is still capable of producing warriors like Halvran Tain. And that hope terrifies me. Because hope is the most dangerous thing the Imperium can face. It is more dangerous than heresy, more dangerous than rebellion, more dangerous than any Xenos threat. Hope implies the possibility of change, the belief that things could be different, the conviction that the current order is not eternal, and the Imperium cannot tolerate that. It survives by crushing hope, by insisting that the galaxy is irredeemably hostile, that humanity is forever besieged, that the only choice is obedience or extinction. The Brazen Vigil rejected that binary. They chose a third path, and in doing so, they proved that the binary was false. They proved that humanity could survive without the Imperium's permission, that warriors could serve the Emperor without serving the High Lords, that faith could exist independent of structure. And now I am left with a choice. I can continue to serve the Imperium, to enforce its laws, to preserve its continuity, knowing that I am sustaining a system that values control over truth, obedience over righteousness, survival over meaning. I can file my reports, draft my rulings, adjudicate my cases, and die at my desk like my father, with ink still wet on documents that will never matter. Or I can walk away. I can resign my position, abandon my authority, step outside the machinery that has defined my existence for 50 years. I can become a ghost, like the Brazen Vigil, unrecognized and unacknowledged, free to pursue whatever small measure of truth I can find in a galaxy that has forgotten what truth means. I do not know which choice I will make, but I know that the decision itself is proof of what the Brazen Vigil accomplished. They forced me to see the limits of law, the boundaries of authority, the truth that existence does not require permission. They forced me to confront the possibility that the Imperium, for all its grandeur and power and 10,000-year history, is not eternal. They forced me to imagine a future where the machinery collapses and humanity continues regardless. And that imagination, fragile as it is is the most dangerous thing I possess. I have spent my entire life in service to the Imperium, and I have learned only one thing. The Imperium is not humanity. It is a structure built to protect humanity, a framework designed to hold civilization together in the face of annihilation. But it is not the same as the people it governs, the warriors it commands, the faith it claims to represent. And when that structure begins to prioritize its own preservation over the people it was created to protect, when it begins to erase heroes because they are inconvenient, when it begins to value obedience over truth, it ceases to serve its purpose. The Brazen Vigil understood that. Halvran Tane understood that. And now, finally, I understand it too. I do not know what will happen to the Imperium. I do not know whether it will endure for another 10,000 years or collapse within my lifetime. I do not know whether the Brazen Vigil will survive their exile, or whether they will be forgotten entirely, their deeds lost to time, their sacrifices unrecorded. But I know that they existed. I know that they fought. I know that they refused to be erased. And I know that, somewhere in the dark corners of the galaxy where the Emperor's light barely reaches, they are still fighting, still serving, still believing. And that is enough.